The view from our San Francisco penthouse was swallowed by the evening fog, a silent, gray expanse that mirrored the stillness inside. The only sound was the faint hum of the air purifier, a sterile breath in the cavernous space. I placed a hand on my swollen belly, feeling the gentle stir of our sun, and gazed at where the lights of the Golden Gate Bridge should have been, lost in the indifferent haze. At 37 weeks pregnant, my ankles had vanished, replaced by puffy appendages that felt alien. Tonight was Marcus's moment of triumph. He was launching Nexus, the revolutionary AI he'd poured his life into. This platform will literally change the way people think, he'd promised that morning, clipping a sleek microphone to his lapel. His reflection in the dark glass of our window, looking less like my husband and more like a celebrated tech icon. Marcus's last message, keynote starting, had buzzed on my tablet 3 hours earlier. I'd typed back a quick, "knock 'em dead," but received only silence. He's surrounded, I told myself. Investors, journalists, industry titans. The air in our home, rich with the scent of gardenias he'd had delivered, felt thick with a nameless dread. The launch was being live-streamed, a fragile digital connection to the world he was currently conquering without me. I finally pulled up the feed on our wall-sized screen, the gesture feeling more like a solemn duty than a choice. The stream opened with a moderator singing Marcus's praises. "And now, let's hear from the visionary himself," she chirped. There he was on stage, a master of his universe, under the harsh stage lights, dressed in his signature black turtleneck, radiating an aura of absolute command, the quiet power of a man who builds empires from code. A familiar wave of pride washed over me, until a chilling detail caught my eye. Marcus was being interviewed solo, but the camera kept panning to the front row behind him. Maybe it was just the pregnancy hormones. Maybe the endless nights he claimed were spent beta testing were legitimate. Maybe my unease was just a product of being cooped up in this gilded cage. Then my eyes landed on the VIP seating, and I saw her. She wasn't next to him, but she was in his immediate orbit, a silent partner waiting in the wings. She was positioned to be his confidant, his next logical step. She smiled at something Marcus said to the interviewer, her head tilting with an expression of intimate understanding. From the stage, he glanced in her direction and gave a faint, knowing nod in return. It was the relaxed, unguarded look I hadn't seen from him in months. My breath caught a sudden, sharp pain, as if the oxygen in the room had turned to glass. Around her, Silicon Valley's elite schmoozed and networked, oblivious to the fact that my entire world had just shattered on a high-definition stream. The baby kicked, a hard jab right beneath my ribs. "Easy, little man," I whispered, my voice shaking with a confusion I couldn't articulate. "Is that the new head of strategy from the London office?" For a second, I held my breath. I sat perfectly still, my hand pressed flat against my stomach, my body frozen, while my mind scrambled to construct a plausible narrative, anything to shield myself from the glaring truth. Marcus was on his throne, a king. He wasn't just near her. And for one foolish, desperate moment, I let a sliver of hope in. Maybe she was his designated handler for the press. Maybe it was just a professional courtesy he'd failed to mention. Perhaps in his closing remarks, he would thank his amazing wife, Olivia, watching from home, pulling me into his victory from thousands of miles away. I clung to that flimsy possibility, like a drowning woman to a piece of styrofoam, knowing it couldn't support me, but terrified of the crushing weight of the water below. Then the moderator asked one last question. "Marcus, you've credited your team, but we all know a project this ambitious needs a true north. Who was your guiding star?" He smiled, a polished, media-trained gesture. "That's true," he said, his gaze sweeping the audience, and landing on her without a flicker of hesitation. "Isabel Thorne, our head of strategy," he announced. She was the conscience of Nexus. The camera zoomed in on her, and she offered a modest dip of her head. But it wasn't the words. It was the invisible current that flowed between them, a silent, potent acknowledgement of a shared history that had nothing to do with algorithms. My stomach clenched. This wasn't a CEO praising an employee. This was a man introducing his real partner. The baby shifted, a slow, heavy turn. "Oh," I breathed into the silent apartment. "Why is he looking at her like that?" I tried to swallow the lump forming in my throat, but it was solid and unyielding. My mouth went bone dry, and I was suddenly afraid to breathe too deeply, certain my lungs would crumble into ash. I saw the flash of gold on her blazer as she adjusted the collar, a unique lapel pin I recognized instantly. Her fingers grazed it, a casual touch that drew the camera's focus directly to the piece of jewelry. And then the realization struck me, not as a fear, but as a certainty, as cold and unfeeling as the server racks running his new AI. He hadn't wanted me at the conference to avoid the stress. He hadn't wanted me there because my position was already occupied. The stunning penthouse felt like a prison, its panoramic views a cruel joke. Every congratulatory message lighting up my phone felt like another grain of salt in the wound. Every round of applause from the stream's audio grated against my frayed nerves. I should have closed the laptop. I should have shielded myself from what was coming. But my hand was frozen, paralyzed by a grim compulsion to witness the full scope of Marcus's betrayal. And then the synced file finished loading. Marcus's eyes met the camera in the publicity shot, and for one heart-stopping second, it felt like he was looking right at me. There was no shame, no trace of guilt, only absolute victory. The woman, Isabel, moved to his side, her face radiant with their mutual triumph. Her gaze shifted from him to the lens, soaking in the moment, claiming it as her own. He straightened the collar of his custom shirt, the perfect image of a man who had just conquered Silicon Valley and knew he'd never face a reckoning. I only saw her with horrifying clarity after Marcus smiled for the camera. Before that moment, she was just an impressive founder in a power suit, a threat my intuition had refused to name. But once his gaze met hers, and that public smile softened into something deeply personal, my focus snapped onto her with a cold, terrifying precision. She was younger than me, not by a decade, but by enough years to matter under the brutal clarity of television lighting. She held herself with a sleek, sharp ambition, the kind of deep-seated confidence that comes from a life of getting exactly what she wants. Her gown was understated and ferociously expensive, her makeup a flawless shield, her hair swept back with calculated severity. She moved to his side at the podium and accepted his hand on the small of her back. Her eyes met the camera as if she could see right through it to every person watching at home. There was no deference in her stance, no sign of being a mere employee. There was just a brief, radiant smile, a flash of mutual understanding, and then something else, a quiet assertion of her place, not just by his side, but at the center of his victory, as if she were the one who had laid the foundation. She didn't shrink from the spotlight. She didn't look like an architect on his team. Instead, she angled her body into his, her hip brushing against him. It was almost imperceptible, but it was a clear signal, a silent announcement. Julian started speaking again, answering a final shouted question, gesturing toward Chloe as he lauded her indispensable contributions. She listened with her head tilted, her gaze fixed on him, her lips curved into a perfect image of admiration. It was a masterful performance of partnership. A powerful kick from our daughter finally shattered my paralysis. "Oh, my baby," I whispered, my voice breaking. Who is that woman? The question hung in the vast, empty penthouse. I doubled over, wrapping my arms around my belly as if I could shield her from this. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I searched for words that wouldn't terrify the child I was carrying, for a lie that felt less like acid than the truth. She's just someone who works with Daddy, I murmured. Chloe watched Julian with a laser focus, a portrait of devotion. She was basking in his triumph, reading the room's reaction to them as a couple, and deciding, I knew, whether she was dealing with a wife who would cause a scandal or one who would quietly disappear. I would not give her a scene. I pushed myself to my feet, forcing my back to straighten, forcing my lungs to take in steady air. I met her eyes on the screen, a total stranger who had just demolished my life. I saw it clearly then. She believed she had earned all of this. Not just the man, but the entire kingdom that came with him. The acclaim, the influence, the title of his most essential partner. She had no idea she was just another asset in a portfolio that would one day demand a cost she could never anticipate. And neither of us knew that this public humiliation was only the first move. Julian walked through the door 3 hours later, glowing with success and champagne. He didn't look for me. He didn't call my name. He didn't seem to register my presence at all. He dropped his keys into a glass bowl on the console, his confidence only wavering when he finally saw me sitting there in the dark. His posture stiffened, his face shifting into the smooth, diplomatic mask he used for difficult clients, the one engineered to diffuse any potential conflict. Amelia, he said, his voice quiet, measured, you're still awake. I was just about to text you. The unveiling was a massive success. Not, I'm so sorry. Not, we need to talk. Not even, it's not what it looked like. Just a status report. In that moment, everything crystallized. His anger wasn't for my shattered heart. It was annoyance at having to deal with the fallout. For the last hour, my phone had buzzed with messages from acquaintances. Their congratulations on the charity gala, feeling thin and laced with a strange kind of pity. The way he strolled over, all casual confidence, felt like a desecration. Arthur followed my gaze to the woman across the room and the constellation of diamonds at her throat, his jaw tightening as he realized what I now knew. I'm exhausted, Eleanor, he said, his tone clipped and dismissive. Can we not do this here? Do this, as if my entire world, collapsing, was just an inconvenient bit of drama he could postpone. The baby gave a soft kick, a tiny searching pulse. I laid a hand over my stomach, the life inside me a quiet anchor in the hurricane of his betrayal. You forgot to tell me your star analyst was your +1, I said, my voice unnervingly calm. The steadiness in my own voice was a shock. Arthur took a sharp breath, a flash of pure irritation in his eyes before he masked it. It's a professional courtesy, Elle. That was his fatal error. Professional courtesy was the phrase men like him used when the truth was simple and predatory. He glanced towards the bar. Isabel, as I was now sure she was called, had slipped away, but her absence was a tangible chill between us. We can talk about it when we get back to the brownstone. I don't want you getting agitated in your condition. A profound coldness seeped into my bones. He was already using our unborn child as a shield, attempting to reframe my fury as some kind of delicate, hormonal fragility he had to manage. I think I'm strong enough to hear the explanation, I countered. For the first time all night, Arthur's gaze dropped to the curve of my belly. Eleanor, he began, his attempt at a gentle tone sounding manufactured and empty. Let's not be theatrical. I remained silent. I simply met his eyes with a look I barely recognized as my own. It was terrifyingly still, sharp, and completely fractured. In the society pages, Isabel had been lauded for her market foresight. That necklace wasn't just a gift, it was a public claim. Arthur squared his shoulders, his voice hardening. We'll discuss it when you're being rational. We'll handle this at home, he dictated, the words of final judgment from a man who believed every problem had a price. And in that moment, I saw who Arthur truly was when his curated world was threatened. A man who used composure as a bludgeon, a man who mistook silence for submission, a man utterly blind to the wreckage he was about to create for himself. Arthur's polite smile remained fixed, as brittle as spun sugar. He paused, studying Lily's expression, probably anticipating tears or a quiet hug. Some kind of filial comfort that would reaffirm his role as the benevolent father. Lily gave him nothing. She just looked up at him with those clear, perceptive eyes that had already learned to see past his surface-level charm. I felt her small hand release mine as she took a hesitant step forward, no longer needing me for protection. "Daddy," she began, her voice small but firm. Arthur's shoulders relaxed a fraction, a trace of relief softening his face. "Yes, my love." Lily paused, and I could almost feel the gears turning in her mind as she connected the pieces. This wasn't a tantrum. There were no tears. This was a child trying to make sense of the fractured image of her parents. "Is she why you missed my piano recital?" she asked, her head tilting towards Isabel. "Because you were working on the market reports with her?" The question was a dagger, sharpened by its complete innocence. It carried no anger, no accusation, just a daughter's honest effort to understand. The effect was immediate. Every ounce of color drained from Arthur's face. His jaw hung open for a second before he snapped it shut. Whatever excuse he had prepared for me, whatever narrative he was about to spin, it dissolved under the simple weight of that question. Beside him, Isabel went rigid. For the first time, her flawless corporate poise fractured. Her eyes shot to Arthur, waiting for him to take control, to smooth things over, to protect the perfect, gilded image she had just become a part of. He said nothing. The ambient chatter of the gala seemed to quiet. Donors and board members nearby began checking their phones with a little too much focus, their attention zeroed in on us. The entire ballroom seemed to be holding its breath. "That is not," Arthur started, but his voice broke. He swallowed audibly in the sudden stillness. "It's far more nuanced than that." Lily's brow furrowed. It didn't seem nuanced. A knot of dread and pride tightened in my stomach. I fought the impulse to pull her behind me, to shield her from the suffocating silence and from the truth her father was too much of a coward to say. But a stronger instinct kept me rooted to the spot, letting the scene play out exactly as it needed to. Arthur crouched down, the movement awkward and stiff in his tuxedo. "Lily, adult matters can be very confusing," he said, his voice strained. "Sometimes people make terrible mistakes." Lily tilted her head to the side. "Then why do you look so ashamed, Daddy?" And that was the end of it. Arthur froze, his hands hovering uselessly in midair. He looked precisely like what he was, a powerful man, undone not by a furious wife, but by the devastating clarity of his own child. My eyes burned with unshed tears, but I wouldn't let them fall. This moment was no longer about my pain. This was the moment his daughter finally saw the real man beneath the polished veneer. And Arthur knew it. As his gaze lifted to mine, the fear in his eyes was finally eclipsed by a wave of pure, undiluted shame. And for the first time all evening, he understood that something fundamental had been broken beyond repair. No matter how he tried to spin this later, the truth was already out, and it had not come from me. Arthur straightened up, his features hardening as if bracing for a market crash. The shame Lily had exposed was gone in a flash, replaced by a cold, familiar resolve. I recognized that look. It was the one he got during hostile takeovers when the numbers turned against him and he shifted from strategy to raw power. "All right," he breathed, tugging at the lapels of his $5,000 tuxedo. His voice dropped to the deep, commanding tone he used to terrify junior partners. "This ends now." Ends now. Not, "I am so sorry she had to hear that." Not, "I cannot believe I let this happen." Just ends. He did a quick, subtle scan of the room, acutely aware of the lingering gazes of his investors and rivals. He moved closer, his voice a venomous whisper, meant only for me. "You will not cause a scene, Eleanor. We will discuss this later, like adults." I couldn't breathe. I saw his strategy with perfect clarity. He wasn't talking to his wife. He was assessing me as a liability, a volatile stock that had to be contained before it cratered his public image. "No one is causing a scene," I replied, my own voice just as quiet. "This is the scene, Arthur." His jaw tightened. "You're being hysterical," he hissed, his lips barely parting, "and Lily does not need to be a part of it." The words were tactical, each one chosen to wound. "You're hysterical, you're unstable, you are the source of the danger." A hot tide of rage and disbelief crashed over me. For years I had made my world smaller, so his could expand. I had conceded arguments, postponed my own needs, and convinced myself that my silent partnership was a virtue. And now, at the gala meant to cement his legacy, with our daughter between us and our son on the way, he was trying to cast me as the unstable one. Lily instinctively moved closer to my side, her small frame sensing the charge in the air. She was no longer looking at her father. She was looking at me. Isabel shifted her weight on her stiletto heels, her composure now visibly strained. This was not the clean, successful merger she'd anticipated. This was chaotic, public, and brutally human. "Arthur," I said, my eyes locked on his, "you do not get to write the ending to this story." His expression turned to granite. "I am trying to protect this family." It was the most audacious lie he had ever told. He wasn't protecting Lily. He absolutely was not protecting me. He was protecting the brand of Arthur Vance, the financial titan who believed that if he spoke with enough quiet, unwavering authority, reality itself would have no choice but to obey. I realized then that this was never just about another woman. It was about his profound, suffocating need for absolute control. And for the first time, a strange and powerful calm settled over me, and my hands stopped trembling. If I let him silence me here, he would use my silence to define me for the rest of our lives. Whatever happened next, I would not allow it. Not for myself, and certainly not for my daughter. It was Isabel who gathered herself first. While Arthur and I were waging our silent war, she subtly recalibrated, as if reminding herself of her position on the board. Her spine straightened, her chin came up, and she smoothed an invisible crease from her silk gown. The motion was tiny, almost imperceptible, but it sent a clear and devastating message. She was not leaving. Her eyes met mine again, this time without a hint of apology. There was no defiance or guilt, just a cool, analytical assessment, like a strategist observing an opponent's predictable, emotional mistake. Then she smiled. It was not a smile of victory. It was microscopic, controlled, an expression so finely tuned it could almost pass for sympathy. But underneath it was a foundation of chilling confidence. She believed this moment and this man were already hers. "Arthur," she said, her voice a low purr as she finally laid a hand on his forearm. "Darling, you're keeping the partners waiting." Her hand on his arm was less a touch and more an anchor, the word sweetheart, a branding iron in our own foyer. She stated it as a fact, not an endearment. Marcus went rigid, a statue for a split second. His gaze shot from Chloe, to my stunned face, and then to her crimson nails digging into the fabric of his Tom Ford jacket. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, calculating the fallout of this public ambush versus the path of quiet capitulation. He didn't shrug her off. A muscle in Marcus's jaw pulsed as he gave a sharp nod. "I'll be right there." With a triumphant little smile, Chloe released him and pivoted, her entire posture screaming victory. She was absolutely certain he would follow. It struck me in that moment that she wasn't scared at all. Not of me, not of the grenade she'd just rolled into our lives. In her version of the story, the ending was already a foregone conclusion. She was confident Marcus would handle me. He would spin some placating excuse, promise to make it all right, and then he would meet her outside. I was just a messy loose end that needed to be tied up, emotional, inconvenient, and already fading into the background of his past. She was the future standing at the end of this ugly scene. A small elbow jabbed me from inside, a secret, urgent message. She carries herself like a queen who's already won, a voice inside my head observed. It was hard to draw a breath. "That's not confidence," I heard a voice say, realizing with a jolt it was my own. "That's a victory lap." Marcus, his hand on the antique brass doorknob, froze. He looked back at me, a flash of pure irritation crossing his features before the familiar mask of patient concern slid into place. "Eleanor, baby, not now. We'll sort this out later. I have a late-night merger call I cannot miss. Please." It wasn't a request. It was an order. My eyes drifted past him to a framed print in the hall. The two of us in St. Bart's, laughing like strangers I'd never met. A cold, terrifying clarity washed over me. This was so much bigger than a simple affair. Chloe was so sure of herself because Marcus hadn't even bothered to be careful. He assumed my compliance was a given. He genuinely planned to walk out that door to his call, leaving me to weep quietly among the ruins of our marriage. What neither of them grasped was that his breathtaking arrogance wasn't strength. It was a fatal miscalculation. It was an error in judgment that was about to unravel the very future they were so smugly anticipating. I didn't scream. I didn't launch a single accusation. My absolute stillness seemed to disturb Marcus far more than any tantrum ever could. He was ready for the tears, for the recriminations he could brush off as pregnancy hormones. He had a playbook for managing my emotions. He had no plan for my silence. I looked straight at him, not with rage, but with a chilling calm that felt foreign in my own body. "Go," I said. The word was a pebble, dropped into a deep well, flat and heavy, with a finality that was unmistakable. Marcus looked truly baffled, as if I'd started speaking in a language he didn't understand. You're not going to fight me on this," he stammered. A small, brittle smile touched my lips. "Oh, I see everything perfectly now." My whisper carried more weight than a shout. The silence in our New York City brownstone was suffocating, filled with all the truths now laid bare between us. My hand moved to my stomach, a subconscious shield. I felt a gentle roll from within, a secret conversation just for us two. The new person growing inside me was more tangible than the man standing by the door. "I'm going to go stay somewhere else for the night," I stated, my voice even. "I need some air." I saw the relief flood his expression, his whole body untensed. The fact that he agreed so quickly was a deeper cut than any verbal assault. I turned and walked toward the master suite, my footsteps muffled by the antique Persian runner. The significance of what I was doing settled in the air around me. From the back of the walk-in closet, I grabbed a leather weekender. I packed my laptop, my wallet, and without so much as a final look at Marcus, I walked out of the life we had built together. The heavy oak door of the brownstone clicked shut, its quiet thud a more profound end than any slam in the marble-floored entryway. Marcus. I wouldn't let myself turn around. Each step down the sandstone stoop was a deliberate separation from our world, a life lived on one of the most exclusive streets in Manhattan. The distant wail of a siren was a sound from the city I now had to face on my own. I kept my eyes fixed on the gleaming yellow taxi I'd summoned. A look back would have revealed the Japanese maple we planted together in the front garden, its branches once representing our intertwined future. It was just a tree now. The only thing that was real was the insistent flutter deep inside me. This tiny, vulnerable life depended on me to build a new world from the ashes of the old one. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, a push notification illuminated my phone screen. I wouldn't let myself read his name. Not yet. Marcus could wait. His carefully prepared narrative of excuses could wait. The apologies, the justifications for his betrayal, they were all trapped behind that closed door. As the taxi moved through the glittering city streets, a powerful thought began to form. This wasn't me running away. This was the first tactical move I had made for myself in a 7-year marriage that had slowly become a beautiful prison. And though I had no clue what I was going to do in the next 10 minutes, let alone the remaining 5 months of my pregnancy, I knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the author of my story. The hotel room was anonymous, sterile, with a view of a brick wall and other people's windows. The exhaustion I'd been holding back crashed over me, a profound weariness that sank into my soul. For a long time, I simply lay on the crisp, unfamiliar duvet, a hand on my belly, as if I could draw power from the life it held. Only then did I take out my phone, steeling myself for the inevitable digital onslaught. 7 missed calls, 15 text messages, all from Marcus. I cleared them all without opening a single one. Instead, I navigated to the banking portal for my interior design firm's business account, our joint venture. It was my passion project, the company I had built from the ground up. The page loaded, the circle spun, and then the numbers appeared. A cold, nauseating wave of dread crashed over me. The balance was 0. The entire account had been emptied just that afternoon. The transaction log showed a single wire transfer to an untraceable account in the Cayman Islands. My capital, the seed money from my grandfather's estate, the funds I had nurtured with such care, all of it had vanished. For a full minute, the world went silent. I couldn't breathe, a crushing weight pressing down on my chest. I kept refreshing the page, praying it was some horrible mistake. It wasn't. This was calculated. This was a scorched earth tactic. My hands trembled as I tried to log into our personal investment portfolio. Access denied. A cold, automated message popped up. Your credentials have been revoked by the primary account holder. Marcus hadn't just been unfaithful, he had financially executed me. My phone vibrated again. An email from his lawyer. The subject line read, "Regarding your marital assets. Attached, please, find the proposed terms of separation." Proposed, as if it were a deal to be brokered. I stared at the dense, legalistic text until the words blurred. Separation, as if our marriage was a stock to be liquidated, as if he hadn't just committed financial warfare, leaving his pregnant wife with nothing. I looked around the generic hotel room, at the bland art on the walls, and my one small duffel bag. For the first time since Chloe appeared at our door, a sharp, primal fear pierced through my shock. I had no access to money, no family in the city, and the one person I would have called for help was the man who had just declared total war. I sat on the edge of the bed, shivering, my mind replaying the moment I knew, the receipt from Cartier. Found in his coat pocket, when I'd gone to send it for dry cleaning. The item description had burned itself into my memory. Custom engraved love bracelet. The price tag was astronomical. He hadn't even tried to hide it. Now, his brutal efficiency was terrifyingly clear. He never dreamed I'd find it before he left for his merger call. I curled into a ball, pulling the thin bedspread around me, watching the distant lights of the city. And in the void, where my shock had been, something else started to crystallize. It was cold, sharp, and resolute. It was rage. Because if Marcus believed gutting our finances would render me helpless, he had forgotten about the one asset he could never seize. The woman I was about to become, now that I had absolutely nothing to lose. Dawn broke over the East River, casting a pale, indifferent light into the room. It felt too normal, too peaceful for the chaos my life had become. The baby stirred, a gentle nudge reminding me I was not alone in this fight. I willed myself out of bed, showered, and ordered coffee, my actions deliberate and mechanical. I sat at the small desk, opened my laptop, and saw a new email from Marcus himself. The subject line was just 2 words, devoid of any emotion: the terms. My heart hammered against my ribs as I moved the cursor and clicked it open. He wrote about the need for a low-stress paradigm, for prenatal mindfulness, and the importance of a stable maternal environment for our baby. He cited his demanding schedule as a venture capitalist and my current emotional volatility. Then I saw the line that felt like a physical blow. To ensure all communication remains productive during this period, I think it's best we liaise through our assistants. He was creating a documented history of my alleged instability. He was already building his case for a custody fight. I scrolled down, my teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached. He offered a comprehensive financial package to cover my needs until the delivery. He recommended I relocate to a more manageable residence he'd found. Every single methodical strike was disguised in the language of benevolent concern. There was no mention of Isabel, no mention of the architectural firm built on my inheritance that he had just absorbed into his fund. This wasn't a separation. It was an acquisition. I closed the laptop and saw my own reflection in the dark screen. My face was pale, and my eyes were wide with shock, but a new, hard light was kindling in them. For years, I had interpreted Marcus's ruthlessness as ambition, his secrecy as focus. I had been a complete and utter fool. A sharp buzz from the intercom made me flinch. A quick glance at the security panel showed a courier standing in the hallway. I shook my head and hit the ignore button, the silence of the penthouse suddenly feeling immense and suffocating. A tidal wave of isolation crashed over me. I needed an ally. My fingers felt numb as I called my sister, Olivia, in Boston. "Amelia? It's after midnight here. What's happened?" And then I told her. The whole ugly story tumbled out of me in a frantic, breathless confession. Olivia let me speak until I had nothing left. The only sound the faint digital hum between San Francisco and Boston. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was calm, analytical. "This is a narrative play," she said. "Marcus has always controlled the story. But Amelia, be honest with me. When was the last time you designed something for yourself without first running it through the filter of how it would benefit his brand?" The question landed with the force of a physical blow. Marcus thought his capital, his team of corporate lawyers, and his surprise attack gave him an ironclad advantage. He was certain that soulless memos and business speak could disguise his betrayal as a strategic pivot. What he never understood was that by reducing our shared life to a transaction, he had stripped away all the emotion, leaving me with the ice-cold clarity I so desperately needed. I was done trying to find a conscience in a man who clearly had none. If he wanted to fight this war with press releases, Then I would become a master of opposition research. I would arm myself with contracts and blueprints, and I would stop playing the part of the compliant, supportive spouse. My sister's lack of comforting platitudes was more potent than any emotional outburst could have been. As a political strategist, she operated in a world of ruthless pragmatism. Her quiet was the sound of 1,000 counteroffensives being calculated and discarded. I paced the polished floor of the penthouse, the phone hot against my ear as I waited for her assessment of my shattered world. She was analyzing his weaknesses, identifying leverage points, and mapping out the first moves of a hostile campaign. When she finally spoke, her tone was low and lethal. Amelia, he's not just preparing to leave you. He's building a public case to portray you as an unfit parent. My own voice came out as a ragged whisper. Olivia, what do I do? Olivia's tone was all business. When you merged your architectural firm with his fund, did his lawyers draft the partnership agreement? The question felt like a bucket of frigid water. I did, I confessed. They handled everything. It felt more efficient. A knot of pure dread tightened in my stomach. He had engineered this from the very beginning, before he even proposed. My hand trembled as I steadied it against the cold window. You did not do anything wrong, Amelia, Olivia said, her voice firm. You trusted your partner. That's not a weakness in your character. She paused, taking a breath. But you're avoiding my real question, she pressed. He gave you a business plan for your life. He dictated the terms. In all that time, did he ever once stop to ask you what your vision was? The profound silence that followed was the only answer she needed. No one ever asks for your vision, Amelia, Olivia said, her voice softening just a fraction. Her words cracked a dam inside me. I leaned against the cool glass, stunned not by the truth of it, but by the fact I had never allowed myself to consciously see that massive void at the center of my marriage. I've watched it for years, Olivia continued, her tone hardening again. Marcus launches, Marcus acquires, and you just build the beautiful world for it to happen in, but nobody is looking out for your interests. A single hot tear traced a path down my cheek. I instinctively wrapped my free hand around my stomach, a futile gesture to hold my fractured life together. I'm fine, I lied, the words feeling like dust in my mouth. I have to be. I know, she answered, but I am so relieved you finally see the man behind the carefully crafted image. She clutched the phone, her strength traveling across the country. I'm booking you a seat on the first flight to Boston. In that moment, an idea that was both terrifying and thrilling took root. Marcus had not just miscalculated my own resilience. He had completely forgotten about my sister. For the battle that was coming, the injunctions, the depositions, the vicious spin, he had absolutely no concept of the storm he had just pulled down on himself. The most credible witness to his true character was already assembling my war room. I found Ms. Diana Sterling through a trusted contact of Olivia's. The text message had been direct. You're meeting her in San Francisco. The appointment is set. She dismantles bullies for a living. Her office was on the top floor of a discreet brownstone, the kind of place where family empires were quietly dissected with surgical skill. I sat in the silent waiting room, holding a cup of tea I couldn't drink, feeling like a fraud in a world of inherited wealth and power. Amelia? A composed voice said. I looked up. The woman was in her late 40s, radiating a kind of calm authority that didn't need to be announced. Her eyes were sharp and perceptive, assessing me, not with pity, but with a quiet, professional intensity. Please come in, she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. Thank you. She gave a brief professional nod and sat down, placing a slim notebook on the desk between us. We made some forgettable small talk about the San Francisco fog and the city's unique charm. The conversation was perfectly bland until her gaze fell on my tablet screen, where I'd been staring at the architectural sketch for a community project, and her polite mask instantly fell away. "Marcus Thorne," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. A paralyzing cold shot through me. How could you possibly know his name? She held my gaze for a long beat before letting out a slow, tired sigh. This is exactly what I was worried about. A terrible dread began to snake through my veins. Worried about what? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she extended a hand. "I'm Diana Sterling. I specialize in dissolving hostile partnerships." That explained the confidence. I had to know more. Diana leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving my face. 10 years ago, I represented his original co-founder during their buyout, she said, each word landing like a chip of ice in the quiet office. The world seemed to fade to a dull roar in my ears. "I know his playbook," she continued. "The initial phase of excessive charm to secure assets, the sudden strategic pivot that is actually a trap, the patronizing calm he displays the moment he's cornered." My heart pounded in my chest. "Are you telling me he has a history of this?" She gave a single, deliberate nod. "The ventures change, but the script never does. I recognized his methods the moment you mentioned his name." I braced myself for a fresh wave of despair or fury. What washed over me instead was something completely different: validation. Not because the betrayal hurt any less, but because, for the first time since that press release appeared on my screen, I knew I wasn't going crazy. Diana slid her business card across the polished antique desk. "I am not here to convince you," she said directly, "but our meeting seems to be more than a coincidence, and I know for certain that you do not deserve what he is planning." My gaze shifted from the elegant, simple card to her face. "What do I do?" Her expression was solid as stone. "I suggest you stop absorbing his narrative and start building your own." As my fingers hovered over the keyboard, a terrifying clarity washed over me. Ethan had an algorithm for my anxiety. He had a flowchart for my grief. What he had no contingency for was me, on a video call with the one person in the world who had already seen his entire source code from start to finish. Isabel didn't rush me. That was the first thing I noticed, as the hum of Seattle's tech corridor buzzed far below her silent office. She let the quiet hang in the air, giving me the space to absorb it, to feel the cold dread, and to decide if I needed a soft place to land or a hard weapon. "I'm not asking you to trust me," she said finally. "I'm asking you to trust your own analysis." I gave a slow, numb nod. She shared her screen, not with a business plan, but with a network graph, a dizzying web of crypto transactions and shell corporations, linked by glowing arrows. "The pattern starts here," she explained, pointing to a line on the tablet. "Sudden, urgent business trips to Singapore or Dubai. Then come the extravagant apologies, rare paintings, vintage jewelry, gifts that double as emotional collateral. After that, he begins the extraction." My throat tightened. "He starts liquidating assets," she went on, "not with big, flashy sales. It's a slow bleed, moving capital into offshore accounts and crypto wallets. Bit by bit, until the life you've built together is financially hollow. Then his personality flips. He becomes incredibly attentive, almost suffocatingly kind." I pictured Arthur's message from that morning. "We'll find the optimal path forward." My fingers curled into a tight ball. "And the baby?" I whispered, my voice barely there. Ms. Davis's gaze sharpened. "The baby is his trump card. He'll frame his manufactured concern as a sign of his stability. He'll leverage your pregnancy, your hormones, your delicate condition to paint you as an unreliable parent. He'll position himself as the only rational actor in the entire drama." It took all my willpower to ask the next question. Did it succeed? The last time he did this? She paused, her eyes distant for a moment. Temporarily, yes, she admitted, her tone heavy with experience. My last client's divorce was a siege, she said, but I memorized his playbook. I saw how he methodically manipulated these brilliant, powerful women into doubting their own judgment, while he maintained this perfect facade of calm control. By the time they realized what was happening, they were already trapped, forced to react to his carefully orchestrated moves instead of initiating their own. A sharp, icy clarity pierced through my panic. He's counting on me to shatter, I said, the words coming out as a faint breath. Ms. Davies nodded once. It's the cornerstone of his strategy. I stared back at the tablet, at the horrifyingly familiar sequence laid out before me. The flowchart was a nightmare, but seeing it laid bare was also strangely empowering. Isabella, I said abruptly, the software developer. Does she have a clue? A faint, grim smile appeared on Ms. Davies's lips. She knows the narrative he's fed her, that you're struggling emotionally, that the marriage has run its course, that he's just trying to navigate a difficult situation with grace. The emotion that welled up inside me wasn't envy. It was a sudden, sickening surge of pity. She thinks she's his future, I murmured. They always believe they're the exception, Ms. Davies said, her voice steady. I sank back into the chair, as the last few weeks clicked into a horrifyingly clear picture. The investment prospectus I'd found. His recent trips to San Francisco to mentor a new startup, the sudden transfer of his art gallery shares into my name, the placating texts. Arthur wasn't floundering because I'd found out about his affair. He was executing a meticulously planned demolition of our life, a project years in the making. The most chilling part wasn't that he believed he was more clever than I was. It was his absolute certainty that I would never comprehend the full scope of his plan until I was left standing alone in the wreckage. I met Ms. Davies's eyes. So what's the countermove when your adversary has already anticipated your entire game plan? She pushed the tablet across the wide, polished desk toward me. You don't play his game. You rewrite the code. For the first time since my entire world had fractured, I felt solid ground beneath my feet. It wasn't hope. It was a strategy. I didn't call Arthur when I left her office tower. That was the first decision he could have never predicted. Instead of hitting him with a barrage of emotional calls and furious texts, I did something far more unsettling to a man obsessed with control. I went dark. I answered his messages, but only after a delay of several hours. My replies were brief, agreeable, and vague, a perfect impersonation of the confused, overwhelmed wife he was preparing to describe in a legal deposition. While he thought I was falling apart, I was building my fortress. Ms. Davies put me in touch with a blockchain forensics expert. I began channeling the commissions from my art consulting work into a new private bank account. We started to meticulously chart every shell corporation Arthur had created and every crypto wallet he had funded over the last 2 years, assembling a complete architectural diagram of his financial escape route. I never breathed a word of it to him. I was simply gathering my evidence. At night, with the San Francisco Bay glittering outside my window, I would sit with my laptop, sipping chamomile tea, and immersing myself in California community property laws, landmark custody rulings, and high-stakes negotiation tactics. I was becoming fluent in a new language, one where a reasonable text message was an exhibit of manipulation and strategic silence was a declaration of strength. Arthur sent another text. Glad we can stay aligned on this. We need to do what's best for the baby's future. I nearly laughed out loud. He read my calm as surrender. He saw my civility as a fatal flaw. He interpreted my silence as shock, because that was the only role he had ever assigned me in his elaborate production. Ms. Davies had counseled me to be patient. Men like Arthur get reckless when they believe they've already won, she had advised. Give him enough rope to braid his own noose. And so I complied. I agreed to an initial meeting with a mediator. I never brought up the investment prospectus. I never challenged his version of our financial standing. I allowed him to talk at length about market disruptions, 10-year growth plans, and building a dynasty for our unborn son, knowing that every single word was just another document from my growing file. In the background, my lawyer, Ms. Davies, submitted the official, procedural requests for financial disclosure, a quiet, bureaucratic move he was legally bound to answer. When the paperwork came back, his entire scheme was laid bare. Arthur hadn't just moved money, he had systematically made it disappear. There was a web of newly established holding companies and tech startups funded at a fraction of their market value, all engineered on the belief that I wouldn't know where to even begin looking until it was far too late. Ms. Davies looked at me from her side of the desk. This is an impenetrable fortress. I nodded. I know. What Arthur failed to understand was that my objective was never to burn his venture capital firm to the ground. I had no interest in a public war or a theatrical confrontation. I was building a legal case so structurally perfect that he would have zero leverage, no exit clause, and no room to negotiate. Every condescending text he sent explaining startup financing to me, a successful art consultant, became a piece of evidence. Every effort to portray me as the emotional, unstable pregnant wife only reinforced his own documented pattern of coercive control. And piece by piece, without ever elevating my voice, I was quietly drafting a brand new conclusion to the story he had written for me. By the time he realized I was no longer reacting to his strategy but executing my own, the terms of our separation had already been irrevocably altered. This time, I wasn't just an asset in his portfolio. I was the one holding the veto power. Isabella called me 3 days later. The number came through as blocked on the burner phone I was using, and I almost ignored it. But a gut feeling made me answer. Amelia? A voice asked, laced with a forced, professional brightness. It's Nina. I'm the lead engineer on Arthur's Nightingale project. Nightingale. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment. I'm aware of who you are. A tense, static-filled silence hung between us. I just felt I had to reach out, she stammered, the confidence in her tone already cracking. There's been a significant communication failure, I think. Arthur is facing an insane level of pressure with the upcoming beta launch. I remained silent, allowing her to wrestle with the emptiness. The explanation then spilled out of her, a well-rehearsed script about aggressive venture capitalists and crippling server bugs, and how the last thing anyone wanted was for there to be any fallout. It was the classic Silicon Valley playbook for managing a crisis, designed to neutralize the human element without ever admitting fault. But then, the corporate facade started to crumble. He's not answering my calls, she said, her voice now sharp with an undercurrent of panic. He said we need to establish some distance right now to manage the optics. And there it was, the part of the business plan she had never been privy to. Arthur hadn't picked her over me. She was just another line item, a temporary asset intended to smooth his transition from one phase of life to the next. Now that the transition was facing unexpected turbulence, he was shedding non-essential liabilities. I see, I said, my voice perfectly level. Isabella let out a sound of pure frustration. This isn't right. He promised me a controlling stake in the company. I fought back the impulse to laugh. Instead, I asked, my voice very soft. Did you ever get that promise in a signed term sheet? The profound silence on her end of the call was the only answer I needed. She scrambled to regain her footing. He told me you were going through a hard time, that this divorce could get complicated, and he needed to protect the company's image for the stakeholders. All of my anger had vanished, replaced by a cold, solid resolution. He tells everyone that, I stated plainly. It's his standard operating procedure when he needs you to accept his terms without a fight. I could hear her sharp, sudden intake of breath. What is that supposed to mean? She asked. I selected my next words with surgical care. It means that if he was truly planning a merger with you, he would be integrating your assets, not just showing you artist renderings of a future that doesn't exist. Another silence, this one much longer. And he's not, she whispered as the reality finally crashed down on her. No, I confirmed. He's not. We ended the call a few seconds later. There were no bitter words, no final accusations, just the quiet hum of a woman realizing she was nothing more than a sunk cost on a balance sheet. That evening, Ms. Davies sent me an email. Arthur's legal team had filed a request for a delay, blaming unprecedented volatility in the venture capital markets, which was affecting his personal liquidity. He was trying to buy time. Isabella had believed she was the flagship investment, the billion-dollar IPO, the future of the company. She never grasped that for men like Arthur, partners aren't replaced with superior models. They are simply replaced with more stable investments. When the data became inconvenient, he did what he always did. He quarantined the bug. Ethan's world didn't suffer a catastrophic system crash. It began to corrupt, the way his ventures always did. In encrypted server logs and digital wallets, he was convinced no one would ever have the clearance to audit. But this time, his carefully architected firewall didn't protect him. It trapped him. Ms. Davies, my lawyer, called me on a Tuesday. The digital forensics team cracked the holding company's server, she said, her voice sharp and clear, and they've traced the crypto wallet funding Project Nova directly to Sasha. I stood in my new, much smaller condo, watching the ferries glide across Puget Sound, in a city that had already forgotten the tech wunderkind who once promised to revolutionize its future. So what happens now? I asked. It means he misappropriated investor capital for personal use, she clarified. Once that is officially filed with the court, his entire credibility with the venture capital community is gone. Ethan missed a critical pitch meeting and then a follow-up. His lead investors put his next round of funding on hold, then withdrew their offer entirely. Every broken promise triggered a new clawback clause in his term sheet. Every penalty dragged another one of his secrets into the light. At his deposition, he was arrogant and condescending, his usual calm, logical facade cracking under a frustration he couldn't debug. The man who gave keynote speeches on algorithmic transparency couldn't explain the tangled mess of his own company's expense reports. His answers became evasive, his logic riddled with bugs. That's when Ms. Davies intervened. Mr. Sterling, she said evenly, this entire proceeding is about establishing a clear data provenance. Provenance? The word echoed in the sterile conference room, an error message he couldn't dismiss. Weeks later, the judge's ruling came down. A full, court-appointed auditor to take control of all his personal and corporate assets, immediate repayment of all funds diverted to the shell projects. I was granted sole custody of our infant son, Noah, with Ethan's visitation rights suspended until he completed a court-ordered behavioral assessment. It wasn't the payback I once imagined, but the security the data had promised. Ethan tried to run damage control, sending carefully worded statements to tech journalists, but the story was too compelling. The professional fallout was immediate and absolute. The Seattle AI Summit announced his keynote had been canceled due to unforeseen scheduling changes. His name was quietly scrubbed from the panel of judges for a prestigious innovation award. The young coders he had mentored suddenly stopped responding to his messages. I felt no joy in watching his empire crash. From my quiet part of the city, I watched the tech dynasty he'd built on disruptive innovation and media hype begin to glitch under the weight of his own corrupted code. Ethan had always moved through the world as if ethical frameworks were for ordinary, unimaginative people who couldn't find the workarounds. He never imagined the system failure would happen on his own server. The last text he ever sent me lit up my phone late one night. I never ran a simulation for this outcome. I glanced at the words, then placed my phone's screen down. This was the only way it could have ever resolved. He was just too insulated by his own echo chamber to see it because, until now, someone else had always been there to patch his bugs. As I tucked Noah into his crib that night, he stirred and looked up at me. "Are we safe now, Mommy?" "Yes, my sweet boy," I promised, my voice steady. "We are." And for the first time since I'd stumbled upon that hidden dataset, I felt it was the absolute truth. Ethan had lost the one thing he valued more than any patent, his flawless public narrative. And for that kind of catastrophic data loss, there was no backup. Our new condo was a fraction of the square footage of the smart home penthouse we'd fled. The windows looked out onto a rain-slicked street instead of the sweeping Seattle skyline, and the old radiator hissed and clanked. But it was our refuge. It was filled with afternoon light, and it was a 10-minute walk from Noah's daycare. When we left, we took only what we could fit into my SUV, along with a deep sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. It turned out that tranquility didn't require a smart home automation system. Our days fell into a new, gentle rhythm. Mornings were no longer a frantic race against a synchronized schedule. I would sip my coffee while Noah, buckled into his high chair, would babble at the crows on the fire escape and carefully paint his hair with yogurt. I set up a small workstation in our living room, the tapping of my keyboard a soft beat against the city's hum. No one was there to second-guess my logic. No one was there to critique my tone. No one was there to gently suggest my memory of an event was corrupted. In the evenings, with Noah sound asleep, I would curl up with a paperback, the quiet hum of the refrigerator a comfort, never once tensing up at the electronic chime of a key card unlocking the front door. I didn't miss the cold, sterile echo of that glass house in Palo Alto. I didn't miss that constant, grinding pressure that we had convinced ourselves was just ambition. I didn't miss the way I had conditioned myself to mentally edit every single thought before I allowed it to become a word. This new freedom was quieter and more profound than I had ever let myself believe was possible. My attorney, Eleanor, would phone me from time to time, not to discuss the case, but just to talk. "You sound so centered, Amelia," she told me during one of our calls. I hadn't realized just how much I needed to hear someone else confirm it. Arthur became a series of scheduled, impersonal afterthoughts, his existence reduced to emails and formal requests filtered through our respective lawyers. He no longer made demands that were thinly veiled as suggestions. He no longer constructed elaborate castles of justification. His control over my life had completely evaporated, and along with it, the bulletproof certainty he used to wear like custom-coated armor. It was my brother, Ben, who first put the change in me into words. "Your smile is in your eyes now," he announced one afternoon, as we built a wobbly tower out of magnetic tiles. "Is it?" I asked, completely surprised. He nodded with the absolute certainty that only a 3-year-old can possess. "Yep, all the way." A real laugh bubbled up from deep inside me, and I was struck by how profoundly right he was. I wasn't richer. I hadn't been rescued by some hero. I wasn't magically free of fear. But I was self-reliant. I set up my own Wi-Fi. I made my own plans. I trusted my own intuition without running it past a focus group. The life we were building wasn't designed to maximize engagement. It was authentic, and it was completely ours. There are some nights, in the quiet after midnight, when my mind drifts back to that woman staring at a screen of incomprehensible code, feeling her reality glitch with every line she deciphered. I wish I could reach back through time to talk to her, not to tell her it would be simple, but to promise her that the system she was building for herself would one day feel stable again. And that would make all the difference. I met Ben on a crisp, clear autumn day, an encounter that was beautifully analog. It was at the Fremont Sunday Market, the air smelling of fresh rain and roasting coffee, filled with the sound of a lone guitarist. Noah was with his grandparents for the day, and I had gone by myself, wanting to feel a part of the city I was learning to call my own. Ben was at a booth for a local roastery, showing people the art of a perfect pour-over. He was completely in his element, not performing for the crowd but sharing his passion with a quiet confidence. His voice was warm and calm. He talked about the origins of different coffee beans as if they were old friends, about the importance of ethical sourcing, about the simple ritual of making something good with your hands to share with others. I found myself lingering, just listening for much longer than I'd planned. I was looking at a bag of dark roast when he came over. "Taking in the weekly chaos?" he asked, a genuine smile in his eyes. "It's wonderful," I replied. "It feels human." He let out a soft laugh. Human usually tastes better than optimized. We made small talk for a while about the neighborhood, the best rainy day coffee shops, and other uncomplicated things. He never asked why a woman like me was at a busy market alone on a Sunday. He didn't recite a list of awards his coffee had won, or try to sell me on his brand. He just seemed to listen with his full attention. When I mentioned Noah in passing, his expression shifted to one of simple understanding, not pity. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's with her mom this weekend." His tone was straightforward, a simple fact with no complicated backstory attached. We traded phone numbers with an ease that felt like a complete system reboot. During the next few months, our bond developed through quiet, simple moments. He'd send me a picture of a cloud that looked like a dragon. We'd grab tea at a small shop on a rainy Seattle morning, or we'd just sit together on a ferry, watching the downtown skyline recede without feeling the need to speak. He was never intrusive, never dug for details about my past, and seemed perfectly content with whatever I was willing to offer. Then one evening, while we were watching the mist roll across Puget Sound, he said something that touched the very core of me. "I have no interest in trying to fix what came before," he told me, his gaze fixed on the distant Olympic mountains. "I would just be honored to be part of whatever future you want to build." It was the complete opposite of everything I had experienced with Arthur. David wasn't trying to upgrade my personality. He wasn't threatened by my history. He wasn't promising some perfect, optimized existence. And because of that, the emotional armor I had so carefully welded together started to feel heavy and pointless whenever I was with him. David wasn't a prize I had won for surviving. He was a new trail that only appeared after I had learned to read the map of my own heart. And for the first time, in what felt like a lifetime, that felt like solid ground, a place where I could imagine starting over with someone else. We were deliberate. That was the unspoken agreement between us from the start. Life had already taught us both the danger of confusing the fire of passion with the warmth of a true partnership. So we took our time, letting trust grow in the unhurried corners of our days. My son Sam met David several months later, not as a potential replacement dad, but as Mom's friend, David. He came over to help us build a small terrarium for Sam's room and ended up in a deep debate about whether a triceratops could beat a stegosaurus in a fight. David never pushed. He wasn't trying to be the cool new adult or hand out unsolicited advice. He was just there, consistently kind, and let Sam determine how their friendship would unfold. One night, as we were washing dishes after a simple dinner, Sam glanced at David and said, "The apartment feels calmer when you're visiting." A genuine smile bloomed on my face because his words perfectly captured the feeling. David just smiled back and kept drying a plate. The proposal happened on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. We were at a local nursery, the air thick with the smell of damp soil and cedar chips. David turned to me with a question that was as real and grounded as he was. "Eleanor, would you want to create a life with me?" he asked, at our own speed. There was no diamond or grand gesture, just a profound honesty in his eyes. My answer was instant and certain. We were married at a small state park overlooking the water. We had a few rows of mismatched wooden chairs, bundles of wild ferns, nothing for appearances. Sam walked me down the pine needle path, holding our rings in a small cedar box that David had carved for him. When Sam handed us the rings, he whispered, "You seem happy, Mom. Like, really, truly happy." It wasn't a triumphant, flashy kind of joy. It was the sort of happiness that settles deep in your bones and makes a home there. Arthur was not even a ghost of a thought. He didn't need to be. He was a character in a novel I'd closed a long time ago. As David and I exchanged our vows, we didn't promise a life free of hardship. We promised to be patient with each other, to be truthful, and to be a team, especially when life became challenging. Later, as the air grew cool and the sound of our friends' laughter carried on the breeze, Sam came and put his arms around both of us. "This is good," he said. That was the only validation that ever really mattered. The life I had lost, the one defined by penthouse views and biotech galas, had once felt like everything. But standing there, my shoes off on the damp moss, surrounded by people who loved the woman I'd become, I finally saw the truth. My old life wasn't destroyed. It was just cleared away, making room for something authentic to grow. And what grew in its place was not revenge or victory. It was peace. I found myself at SeaTac Airport 2 years later. A different airline, a new destination, but the same hopeful reflection shining back from the immaculate floors. The soft click of the kettle coming to a boil had become the evening's familiar song, a peaceful cadence for our new beginning. This time, Sam looked up from his comic book, a streak of chocolate on his cheek, his hair falling into his eyes. David was dicing an onion at the counter, and he met my gaze with a smile that was pure reassurance. It wasn't a question or a check-in, just a silent, steady connection between us. I paused, my hand on the handle of a cupboard. The memory hit me with the force of an electric shock. I was standing in that same posture in a different, sterile kitchen when my entire reality had shattered, where a meticulously designed life was exposed as a fraud and a horrifying truth was revealed. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with the quiet hum of a server. I remembered the ice that flooded my veins, my knuckles turning white against the quartz countertop. The sickening clarity as his betrayal was laid out not in love letters, but in encrypted genetic data files. David saw my hesitation and came over. "Hey, you here?" he asked gently. I gave a shaky nod. "Yeah, just a ghost passing by." He knew which ghost. He didn't need to ask. Sam looked around our cozy, slightly messy kitchen. "That other apartment had music that came from the ceiling," he commented, not with longing, but with the detached memory of a child. It sure did, I answered, my voice even. He thought about it for a second, then said, I like that our speaker is right here on the shelf. Me too. We sat down for dinner, the conversation easy, the scent of garlic and basil warming the room. Outside the window, the lights of Seattle twinkled, a mosaic of a million separate lives, some extraordinary, some simple. I realized then that the technology, the genetic engineering, the seamless wealth, none of that was the real cage. The prison was the performance, the unending need to project an image of perfection. The fear of that image cracking, and the deeper terror of admitting that the celebrated biotech genius I married was a complete stranger. I had confronted that fear, not by becoming harder, but by letting myself break, by picking a beautifully messy, real life over a sterile, engineered one, by escaping that glass tower when staying would have meant the total annihilation of my spirit. Arthur Vance was now just a name I saw in business journals, attached to some new gene editing breakthrough. He wasn't someone I hated or forgave. He was simply no longer the architect of my world. That chapter was finished. The only thing that mattered was what I had built since. A home filled with laughter, not with automated schedules. A partnership built on trust, not on a public profile. A son who was learning that love is about being there for each other, not about performing for an audience. As we put the dishes away, David wrapped his arms around my waist. Sam started doing a silly monster walk toward the living room, a huge grin on his face. This was real. I glanced at the glowing numbers on the oven's simple clock, then looked back at my family, and a profound calm washed over me. Some endings break you, but others set you free. That afternoon in the home office did both, and standing here now, in my own kitchen, I finally understood the complete arc of my journey. I didn't lose my life in that geneticist's ivory tower. I escaped it. As we bring this story to a close, let's take a moment, because if you have followed this account to the end, it is likely because some aspect of this journey resonated with you on a personal level. This was never merely a story about betrayal and wealth. It stands as a powerful reminder that our most defining moments are often the ones that break us, because they are what allow us to rebuild ourselves into something stronger and more authentic. A key insight can be found in Stoic philosophy. The thinker Seneca once wrote, "True happiness is to enjoy the present, without anxious dependence upon the future." The hurt Eleanor endured was immense, but her healing began not when she plotted revenge against Arthur, but when she chose to reclaim her own sense of self, her own life, and her own future from a reality that was founded on a lie. Another Stoic idea is that the obstacle becomes the way. The encrypted research, the pressure of the biotech world, the betrayal, all of these things became the very materials for her growth, not just the source of her pain. This story shows that walking away from a life that seems perfect to the world is not a failure, and choosing a simpler life is not a step down. Very often, the bravest thing a person can do is to exchange a comfortable lie for a challenging truth. So, if this tale resonated with you, if it mirrored a piece of your own life, please understand that you are not on your journey alone. Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need this message, and subscribe for more stories like this. Your experience and your presence here are incredibly important, and your own story is still being written. The narrative you have just heard is a work of fiction created solely for the purpose of storytelling and exploring emotion. While it takes inspiration from real-life challenges and universal human ideas like relationship dynamics, family difficulties, and personal growth, every character, situation, and event depicted is entirely fictional. Any similarity to actual persons, whether living or deceased, specific locations, or real-life events is entirely coincidental. This narrative is not intended to be a factual account, to offer legal counsel, or to level accusations in the real world. Rather, it aims to explore emotional truths and universal lessons through the medium of a fictional story. The audience is encouraged to view this content as a dramatized scenario created to provoke thought, empathy, and self-reflection, not as a literal record of any real individuals or events. This work of fiction is not designed to inflict harm, propagate false information, or participate in any defamatory acts. It is offered exclusively for the purposes of entertainment, thoughtful engagement, and the cultivation of an emotional rapport with our viewers. Model 1,